Meshech Chochmah, we started last week, Parshas Bereishis. Let's continue. And if you could open up to Perek Beis, Pasuk Tezayin. Let's just read it inside. We have the Pasuk, Perek Beis, Pasuk Tezayin. And the Torah says, Vayitzav Hashem Elokim al ha'odam lemar, B'kol eitz hagan ochel tochel. So we want to emphasize the word lemar. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin derives the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach from different psukim, mostly in either Parshas Bereishis or Parshas Noach. And one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach is Gilui Arayos, adultery, and that's derived from the extra word lemar. And this is based on what we call Gzeirah Shava, where we find the word lemar in a different context, in a different pasuk in Tanakh, and in that other pasuk, it clearly indicates that we're talking about Gilui Arayos. We're talking about having a relationship with another man's wife. Shenemar, the pasuk in Yirmiyahu Perek Gimel opens up with the word lemar, and then it says, Hein yishlach ish es ishto v'alchami ito v'isol ish acher. Now, this pasuk has two parts to it. It has a reisha and a seifa. We just read the reisha. And Tosfos in Masechta Sanhedrin, Adaf Nun Vav, Amid Beis, where the sugya appears, interprets that in fact this reisha is the basis for the equation of lemar lemar. That's how Tosfos understands it. And he's bothered, says Tosfos, why this equation, this Gzeirah Shava, should really shed a light on our pasuk in Gilui Arayos, because the pasuk in Yirmiyahu is not addressing Gilui Arayos per se. It's addressing the case of a man who was married. He divorced his wife. She got married to someone else, and then he remarried his wife. And in such a case, there's not Gilui Arayos. There is a prohibition, but as Tosfos points out very well, that prohibition only applies to a Jew. It doesn't apply to a non-Jew. Now, our Gzeirah Shava, shedding a light on the pasuk here, addresses B'nei Noach, and it's very strange that we're going to interpret lemar as referring to Gilui Arayos, prohibiting an adultery situation in the case of a ben Noach, as one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, from this pasuk of lemar in Parshas Yirmiyahu, which is specifically referring to a case that's not applicable to a ben Noach and does not classify as Gilui Arayos. And the Meshech Chochmah wants to answer this question. And his answer is based on the seifa, which means let's not read the beginning of the pasuk in Yirmiyah, but rather let's read the end of the pasuk. And the end of the pasuk says, V'ata zanisa reim rabim v'shuv elai niyum Hashem. Se'iyeh nayach. And there's an entire pasuk there which ends with the words Vatachnifi Eretz Biznusayich Ubereyasayich. Now, Rabbi Simcha calls our attention to this phrase, Vatanifi Eretz Biznusayach. And this is a reference to adultery, and it has some sort of impact on the Eretz. Now, in order to appreciate the relationship between the word Eretz and the words Nusayach in the Pasuk in Yirmiyah, he refers to another Pasuk, which is in Parshas Kedoshim, and to the Sifra in Parshas Kedoshim. So I have a Chumash here in front of me. I'm going to open up to the Pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, which you'll see here quoted in the Meshech Chochmah. And we're in Perek Yutes, Pasuk Chavtes, and it says, Al techaleles bitchol az nosa, and then it says, V'lo tizne ha'aretz. So the Sifra says that this is an admonition, it's a warning against adultery. And then the Torah adds, V'lo tizne ha'aretz. The same two words, aretz and nusayach, that we saw in Parshas Yirmiyah. And the Sifra in Parshas Kedoshim comments that mizinim hein haperos. So Rashi says in Parshas Kedoshim, if you take a look at Rashi al Torah, he says that the impact of znus on the land of Israel is Tizneh ha'aretz. Tizneh ha'aretz is the consequence of znus. What does that mean, Tizneh ha'aretz? Rashi says, Im ata osa kain, if you'll be guilty of Gili Arayis, then ha'aretz mizaneh, the land is going to be faithless. In other words, just like you were not faithful, and you violated that trust, and you had this adultery relationship, so too the land itself is not going to be faithful. That the trees will not bear fruit in your land, only in other lands. So Rameir Simcha points out that this is the impact and the natural consequence of the violation of immorality. It's going to have an impact on the land itself. The Gzeira Shava here then, between our lemar here in Bereishis and the lemar in Parshas Yirmiyah, is not the beginning of the pasuk in Yirmiyah, which is referring specifically to Machzir Grushaso Liachar Shenises, which is a lav that only applies to the Jewish people, has no impact whatsoever or application to Ben Noach, and therefore Tosfos objects to this logical equation or analogy of Gzeira Shava, which Tosfos says makes no sense, but rather to the Sefer of the pasuk, where Yirmiyah says, "Vatachnifi eretz biznusayach." And how do we know what those words mean? And what's the relationship biznus and the aretz that Yirmiyah is referring to? We can only know that if we open up Parshas Kedoshim, where the Torah says that if you allow your daughter to have this adulterous relationship, then otizneh ha'aretz, and the Parshas Kedoshim, the Sifra says that mizinim es haperos, that the peros will no longer grow in the land, but rather they'll grow in other lands. And the land is not going to be faithful to the people of Israel. Says Rabbi Simcha, onsho shel davar, the punishment for Gili Arayos in the land of Israel, shaperos mizanim, and that's going to be a result of atziras geshamim. The rains will not fall down from the heavens. The ein ru'uyim haperos lechol. There may be various kinds of magefos that, or attacks from different dever and so forth from the different creatures that are going to eat up the peros. And lochein siva olav lemar mikol eitzagan achol tochal. What is the relationship here between the lemar, which refers by allusion to Gili Arayos, and the rest of the pasuk, mikol eitzagan achol teochel? And the answer is that lemar warns us that, and now it's referring to all of mankind, that they should not violate this law of morality of Gili Arayos, and if they live up to that standard, then mikol eitzagan achol teochel, then the earth and the trees will do what they have to do. They'll be loyal, and they'll produce the food that we have to eat. Sheyira, we should be very careful, shelo yizne ba'arayos, because if there'll be a znus of arayos, that's going to mean that you won't be able to eat the fruits of the land. They'll be totally ruined, spoiled. There won't be rains coming down. They won't grow. They'll grow in other lands. And that's what we learn from the Gzeira Shava to the Parsha of Yirmiyah. Says Rabbi Simcha, if this Gzeira Shava tells me that when you have a word at the beginning of one pasuk, and the same word appears elsewhere in Tanakh at the beginning of a different pasuk, you can read that entire pasuk until you finally get to the point where there's a logical connection and a bridge that sets up the Gzeira Shava. If that be the case, says Rabbi Simcha, then we can go back to the first pasuk, which is Lemar, and we could read the entire parsha until we finally stop. Your finger stops at the point where you want to make the Gzeira Shava. And he says if you start reading this second chapter of Bereishis, and you talk about the Eitz Hagan and so forth, put your finger down and fast forward another, shall we say, 8 psukim beyond that, and it says, Al Kain Yazov Adam es Oviv Ishto Imo Vidovak Beishto. That's the part of this context of the Lemar that is being compared to the end of the pasuk that opens with Lemar in Yirmiyah, that ends with the znus and the impact on the land. So that when you get down to the Lemar here in Bereishis Perek Beis, you'll stop at pasuk Chav Daled, which tells you, according to Gemara and Sanhedrin, that a man is not allowed to have a relationship with his friend's wife. In other words, adultery is written right here in this parsha. So that the thrust of this Gzeira Shava of Lemar is not just to tell us that Ben Noach is enjoined from Gili Arayos. That we could perhaps have learned independent of this Gzeira Shava from the pasuk Al Kain V'Davak Beishto, etc. But rather, the Torah wants to tell you what's going to be the repercussions of immorality. And if the people are involved in this kind of a sin, then lo tizneh ha'aretz. That as a result, the peros will not be re'uyim lech. Okay, now, in my edition of Rabbi Simcha, there's another paragraph on this same page. And again, we're in the second chapter of Bereishis in Pasuk Pezayin. We are now leaving behind the first part of the pasuk that we focused on with the Lemar, and we're going to emphasize now the end of the pasuk. Mikol Eitz Hagan Achol Tochel. Says Rabbi Simcha, Pirush Hu Mitzvah. I would have said, if not for Rabbi Simcha, that the Torah is just simply telling me that you're allowed to eat, if you want, from any fruit of any of the trees except for this one. But Rav Meir Simcha says no, that this is a command. This is a mitzvah. Now, I personally love fruit. I hope you all do. But I never thought of it as a mitzvah. From now on, when I eat fruit, after learning this Rav Meir Simcha, I have to realize it's a mitzvah to eat fruit. Lahachios nafsho, first of all, fruit gives you all sorts of vitamins or whatever. And number two, even moreover, it's a mitzvah lehenos mipri agan. Now Hashem is addressing Adam Arishon, telling him, according to Rabbi Simcha, that there's a mitzvah to eat from the fruits. Now, I would have stopped Rabbi Simcha right then in his tracks. I would have said, Rabbi Simcha, with all due respect, I know you're a giant and you're very creative and very original, but to tell me that there's a mitzvah to eat fruit, Meshech, I mean, that's really revolutionary. Kamodi Amar Besof Yerushalmi de Kiddushin, the very famous Yerushalmi at the end of Masechta Kiddushin. People who never opened up Yerushalmi in their lives, they don't know anything about Yerushalmi, but they know this Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says, Asid Adam Litain Din Vecheshbin Al Kol Shara Einav Below Acha. That Liasid Lavo, a person will be taken to task in his judgment for any fruit or any food that he saw and he didn't taste it. That means that you have to taste every single fruit that God created on the face of the globe, and otherwise there'll be a din v'cheshbon. This is what I call the antithetical thesis of Parshas. If you're familiar at all with the Mesilas Yesharim and many other Musar Sfarim, there's something called Parshas. And Parshas projects the attitude that whatever pleasures you enjoy in this world, that'll be subtracted from your merits and your rewards in the next world. So be parish. But this is antithetical. This Yerushalmi has a different philosophy. And Adarabba, you're going to be punished if you were porish when you didn't enjoy the benefits of God's created world. There's Rabbi Simcha. If this is true, that eating fruits is a mitzvah, then let me ask you the following question. Do you have to have kavanah l'shem mitzvah? You know, whatever age I am, but I never had kavanah l'shem mitzvah when I ate those, those pomegranates or whatever I ate. Says Rabbi Simcha, we paskin mitzvos ein tzrichos kavanah. And you can be yotzei of mitzvah even without kavanah. This is great news. I mean, now I have a million mitzvahs now that I didn't even know about. What says Rabbi Simcha? There's one proviso. You have to know it's a mitzvah. You don't have to have kavanah for l'shem mitzvah, but you have to be aware of the fact that there is such a mitzvah. And he proves it from a sugya psachim about achilas matzah. And the Ran quotes the Ra'ah that although the Gemara comes to the conclusion that achal matzah, even if they were forcing him to eat the matzah, he didn't have kavanah l'shem mitzvah yatza, but only because he knows that on Pesach there's a mitzvah to eat matzah. If he was never aware of that fact, he was a total ignoramus, and he had never been taught that there's a mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach, then that's like having a kavanah in the negative, and he doesn't want to be yotzei. He has to know that there's a mitzvah. He's conscious and aware of the mitzvah. Now he's not doing it for the purpose of the mitzvah. Then we activate mitzvah strichas kavanah. Ezra Meir Simcha. I think I have the key to unlock the mystery of two questions. Number one, why did Chava eat from the Eitz Hadas? And number two, who was really guilty of that sin? Two questions that Rav Meir Simcha is now going to answer in a very revolutionary way. Says Rav Meir Simcha, let's read the psukim carefully. Hashem addresses Adam Harishon and tells him, Mikol Eitz Hadas Ochel Tocha. There's a mitzvah to eat from the peros of every tree. Did Adam Arishon convey this to his wife? Did he transmit that mitzvah to Chava? Says Rabbi Simcha, V'im Amar Adam leishto, had man transmitted this mitzvah to his wife, namely that Hashem Yisbarach Tziva commanded us lechol min hagan, then af shelo kivno mitzvah, had she only been aware of this mitzvah, even if she wouldn't have had kavanah for the mitzvah, mikol makom haya kiyuma, she would have fulfilled that mitzvah. She would have a mitzvah say in her back pocket, even if she didn't have kavanah, because she was aware of the mitzvah. But he never transmitted this to his wife. And had she only had that mitzvah in her back pocket, had she only fulfilled that mitzvah, which is written at the beginning of this pasuk, we call Eitz Hagan Achol Tochal, then she would not have violated the lotase of Eitz Hadas Lotoch. Why? Because Magem Shelo Lechol Eitz Hadas. If you're given by the Torah an essay and a losase, the fulfillment of the essay protects you from the allurement and the powers of the evil inclination to violate the lotase. But she was unaware of the mitzvah because Adam Arishon never transmitted it to her. Kevan Shelo Amar Lo b'mitzvahs Hashem Lechol is therefore lo kima mitzvah. Now, how does Rabbi Simcha know that Adam Arishon was negligent in transmitting this mitzvah to Chava? For this, we have to fast forward to Perek Gimel Pasuk Beis, and it says, "Mipri Eitz Hagan Nochal." When she was confronted by the Nachash Chava, again, her name was not yet Chava, but anyway, she did not say Achol Nochal, which means that we will eat because we're commanded to eat. Instead, she said Mipri Eitz Hagan Nochal, meaning we're allowed to eat from any pri. She was totally unaware of the fact that there was a mitzvah to eat from the Eitz Hagan, because she would have said Ochal Nochal. The absence of Ochal Nochal, according to Rabbi Simcha, indicates that she was unaware of the fact that there is a mitzvah. So Vatomer Ishal Nachash Mipnei Eitz Hagan Mipri Eitz Hagan Nochal, but never did she say Ochal Nochal. And the reason for that is because she never got that mitzvah. And then she says, Umi pri ha'etz asher b'toch hagan, meaning the Eitz Hadas, Amar Elokim lo sochlu mimenu. When did she mention to the Nachash that Amar Elokim? Only when she gets to the Lotase. When she speaks about eating and being allowed to eat from all the payroll, she doesn't add the words Amar Elokim. After telling the Nachash that Mipri Eitz Hagan Nochal, then she says, Umipri ha'etz asher b'toch hagan, Amar Elokim lo sochlu. Only when she gets to the Lotas that she mentioned Amar Elokim. And the reason for this is because Adam Arishon he neglected to transmit to his wife that the God had commanded him with a mitzvah, a kiyum mitzvah, like a mitzvah say, to eat from all the fruits of the tree. Had she done so, had Adam transmitted this to her, and she would have fulfilled that mitzvah of eating from pre-Eitz Hagan, even without kavon, it doesn't matter, but she would have been aware of the mitzvah, then we would have activated the principle of mitzvahs, Einam Tzrichas Kavana. Now she has the Kiyum mitzvah in her back pocket. That would have protected her against the influences. That would have given her the siyata d'shmaya to overcome the temptation to eat from the Eitz Hadas and violate the lotus. The essay provides us with the spiritual fortitude and power to avoid violating the lotus. Fascinating insight of Rameir Simcha, answering so many different questions. Now, I'd like to fast forward to, just 1 second, to Perek Daled, Pasuk Aleph. So let's just get a Chumash out. And this is the Parsha, of course, of the murder of Hevel at the hands of Cain. And second, and the pasuk tells us the following at the beginning of Perek Dalet. Va'adam yodas chava ishto, vatar vateled es Cain, vatomer kanisi ish es Hashem. Rashi already points out that kfar kodem ha'inyan shel mala, meaning what's being described here by the Torah actually transpired before the Chet, even though the Chet has already been recorded, and before they were expelled from Gan Eden. So this all took place in Gan Eden. Now, Rashi knows this from a statement in the Bereishis Rabbah. It says in Bereishis Rabbah, Vatar Vateled es Cain, Omar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Gimel Ploim Nasu B'yoso Yom. 3 amazing things happen on that day. Aleph, Bayom Nivru, on that very day they were created. Beis, Bayom Shimshu, they had a relationship, an intimacy. And Bayom, Bo Bayom Hotziu told us. They gave birth. She gave birth. Om Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, Olu Lemita Shnayim, V'yardu Shiva. Cain Uta Omaso, that's 2. Hevel Ushtei Ta'omosa. So Hevel was born with 2 female twins. So they were triplets. And you have twins and triplets, that's 5, plus other Mechava, there were a family of 7. And all this took place on the very day that they were created, before they ate from the Eitz Hadas. Now, what was the situation of mankind before the Eitz Hadas? So Rameir Simcha, quoting the Ramban in his Pirush al Torah, Ramban in turn quotes Chazal, says that Michefetz Habore, it was the original intention of the Creator, Sheyu Nitzchiyim, Bechomer Zach, that the physical, corporeal element of mankind was very spiritual in nature, was very infinite in nature, and man was meant to live for all of infinity. This is the Ramban's Shita. The Rambam never accepted it, but the Ramban's Shita is that Tchias HaMesim will be Guf Uneshama, and after Tchias HaMesim, the Guf will live for all eternity. There'll never be a second death. And the Rambam has problems with that because he believes that physicality could not be eternal. But the Ramban is envisioning a different kind of physicality than what we're familiar with. We're in the post-Chet period. But before the Chet, there was a certain kind of guf that would exist eternally, without death. Imkain, Ein HaTolda, Leos Kiyum Nitzchi B'min. we normally would have assumed that by giving birth to a child, a mother is guaranteeing the continuation of the species. She's adding another generation, another brick in the structure. But that's not necessary, because man was created in a way that he will, and his creatures and so forth, his human creations will live forever. So I don't need the woman to take credit, so to speak, for guaranteeing that there will be generation after generation for all eternity, because one generation itself is sufficient and they would live for all eternity. Lachein Amra, Hanisi Ish Es Hashem. What was her declaration? That was the basis of her calling Cain by his name. Hainu Shegdalti V'Hosafti B'Mitzius U'B'Min. According to Rabbi Simcha, the word Kanisi here indicates what's the responsibility, or shall we say the function of a woman. And that is not to guarantee nitzchius, meaning eternity, but rather to guarantee that there will be a tosefes, that man will expand. There'll be more human beings, Homo sapiens, on the earth. So that's the function of a woman. Kodem, because man was nitzchi, he was eternal by his very essence, by his very nature. Bizel sha'amru chazal, dayenu shemegadlos banenu umatzilos osanu minachet. And this is a Gemara Yevamis, that a woman helps a man when he needs help in preparing food, in planting and harvesting and so forth. She helps, and she also protects him against, thoughts about chas v'shalom other women and so forth and so on. He says that's the ezer that she gives to man. Mevi chitin koses shalikiyum amin lo hayinu tzrichem lo. We don't need her to guarantee that the species will continue to exist, because man, even before Chava gives birth, is going to live for all eternity. But that's Kodem Achet. Aval Yachar Achet, now, man is going to live and die. So therefore, her role changes. Imekayemes min hanoshi. By giving birth, she is guaranteeing that there will be generations to come, and that man will continue to exist, and there will not be a situation in which the earth is desolate of man. Again, before the Chet, we didn't need her to play that role, because man, by definition, would live for all eternity. She wasn't machadish anything. She was only an ezer. She could only help her. But now, after the Gzeira of Misa, as a result of the Chet, the situation is totally different. Now, she, Chava, by giving birth to the next generation, is going to guarantee the continuous kiyum of the min, because there's no longer a guarantee, because now man will die. Lachein, kara shma Chava. Now I understand why originally man called his wife Ishto. We'll go through the psukim if we get a chance. If you go through the psukim, you'll see Lizos Yikra Ish Isha Kimi Ish Lukha Zos. Her name was just Isha. After the Chet, she's granted the name Chava, which means Aim Kol Chai. Now, after the Chet, she's Aim Kol Chai. She really now is necessary to play this role to achieve her task and her function of guaranteeing that the min will continue. And that's called Chava, Aim Kol Chai Ritzona Lomar, Hiya Rishona Shemekayemes Hamin. She was the very first mother that would guarantee the continuation of the species of man. Now we're going to fast forward to Pasuk Ches, which is not the next piece, but the one after that. Vayomer Kain el Hevel Achiv, Vayihi biosam masadeh. Kain said something to Hevel. They were together in the field, and then Cain murders his brother. We don't know, the Torah doesn't spell out what exactly Cain said to Hevel. And in answering that technical question, which is somewhat secondary, Rameir Simcha wants to answer a much more basic question. And that is, how did Cain kill Hevel? I mean, not how, but again, he was jealous, so forth. But what led Cain to do such a horrendous thing? Says Rameir Simcha, a whole new pshat. Yitoche, he Cain Omar El Libo, that Vayomer Cain, first and foremost, means that Cain kind of had a conversation with himself. And in this conversation, Cain wants to understand a pasuk, something that God says. So let's see if we can find the pasuk. One second, let me get myself a little bit oriented here. Oh, I had the wrong page. That's one problem here. Oh, take a look for a moment in Perek Gimel, Pasuk Tes Zayin. Hashem says regarding Chava after the Chet, Vel Ishech Chukasech, Vehu Yimshol Bach. Again, I'm missing one pasuk here. I'm not sure. Okay. So we'll see if we have to fill in one missing blank as we go along. Let's read Rameir Simcha. He says, "Yitochen ki kain omer el libo shekavodas Hashem yisparach bedabro v'elecha chukaso ve'atot timshol bo." One second, where is that pasuk? Does anybody have the Chumash open? If you can tell me where this pasuk is. It says here, "Velishech chukaseh v'huyim shel bach." Why don't I see? What is he referring to here? Oh. Oh, I finally found it. Sorry. This is Pasuk Zayin. So we're in Perek Dalet. Hevel brings his korban, and Hashem accepts Hevel's korban, but not Cain's. And Cain, of course, is very upset. Vayomer Hashem al Cain, and then it says, Halo im teitiv se'es, v'im lo teitiv lepesach chatos rovetz. And it says, Ve'lecha chukaso, v'atotim shol bo. Now, this pasuk is the last pasuk before our pasuk, Vayomer Cain el Hevel. Vayihi b'yosem basadeh, vayokom Cain el Hevel achiv, vayargeu. So Rav Meir Simcha is trying to unlock the mystery here of the contiguity of these two psukim. One pasuk says, Ve'lecha chukaso v'atotim shel bo, and the next pasuk says, Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv. So that Rav Meir Simcha wants to suggest a very profound connection, a very strong connection between these two psukim. When the pasuk says, Ve'lecha chukaso, Cain misunderstood that this statement of the Almighty was referring to Hevel Achiv. And perhaps we can explain it in the following way, says Rabbi Sim, Shehevel mishtokek elov, that Chukaso is referring to Hevel, and a Lecha is referring to Cain. Hashem is telling Cain that a Lecha Chukaso, and what does the word Chukaso mean? Shehevel mishtokek elov li'abdo ula'akchido min ha'olam. Imagine, it's a Pella, but this is the mindset of Cain. Cain thinks that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sort of on his side, on Cain's side, and is revealing a secret of what Cain could not possibly know, meaning what Hevel has in his heart. What was Hevel's intention? And the answer is a lecha chukasa. God is revealing to Cain that his brother Hevel wants to get rid of you. Now, I'm not sure why the word chukaso in this concept, Rabbi Meir Simcha is filling in a major blank over here. Right? A lecha chukaso. He has a certain chuka, Hevel, a lech about you. And that shuka means like an agenda, very powerful, passionate agenda. What is that agenda? That Hashem doesn't tell. But Hashem says, V'ata timshol bo, which basically means you will defend yourself against your adversary who's a rodef. It reminds me a little bit of Rivka, that she knew that Esav in his heart had decided that he wants to do away with Yaakov. I mean, that's just my analogy. Here also, Hashem reveals to Cain, so Cain thinks, that Hevel is really interested in doing him under and getting rid of Cain. But Aval, Hashem says, don't be angry about this, because at the end of the day, Atat Timshel Bo, you'll be able to defend yourself, and you will subjugate Hevel before he does you under. Hainu Shekayin Yimshol Allah, that Kayin, you will be able to successfully defeat your enemy. And this is simply a case of a nirdaf, someone who thinks in his mind, that's how he perceives it, as if so-and-so wants to kill him, and Abola Hargacho Hashkin Lahargo. Below Piresh Divrei Hashem, Shemechuvanim El Chet Ukabir Targum. The Targum says the Osid Lispara Minoch Im Lota Tisov, Vim Tisov Yishtavak Lo. In other words, Targum Onkelos is going to give us the true interpretation of Pasuk Zion, of what Hashem meant when he said, Elecha Chukosav Ata Timshal Bo, as a reference to the Yetzer Hara, that the Yetzer Hara wants to do you under, but you can control the Yetzer Hara, the Pesach Chatos Roves. That is the true intention of what God was telling Cain, that don't get angry and now you're tempted to want to take out your jealousy against your brother Hevel, because you can control your jealousy. But rather, Cain understood that what Hashem was really saying to him was that Hevel wants to kill you, but you will control Hevel. So Elecha Chukaso means that he, Hevel, has you, on the covenant, he wants to do you on. And therefore, Vayomer Cain el Hevel Achiv, Omar Belibo, he said to himself, Shemi Kevon, Shashem Yisbarach Mechavein Hashem Yisbarach El Hevel Achiv. So the El Hevel Achiv is Cain's interpretation of Elecha Chukasa. That Chukasa is a reference to Hevel. He's the one who's trying to do you under, not the Yetzer Hara. And Lochein Omer Hashem Yisbarach, now I can understand a pasuk that didn't make any sense to me. It says, Kol bnei achicha tzoakim elai. What does that mean? That I hear the sound of, or the cries of the blood of your brother yelling out to me. Tzoakim elai doesn't mean crying out of suffering and so forth. Tzoakim elai means somebody who, like demonstrators who get up and yell and say, "Hey, you know good." What is the meaning of what Hevel from his grave is saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What's his petition? Shehu b'dvarav kaviyach, that he, meaning God, with his own words, garam lecharas apol shel Kain el Hevel. That Hashem said something to Hevel that was ambiguous. To Cain that was ambiguous. Cain misinterpreted it, and as a result of God's ambiguity, Cain killed Hevel. So Tzoakim Elai means that now Hevel is yelling at me, and he's pointing a finger of accusation, saying that you, God, were responsible for this murder. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I intuitively sense that a psychologist would have a blast with this chiddush of Rabbi Simcha about how Cain misinterpreted what Hashem said to him, as if Hashem was revealing to him that say Cain, your enemy is not the Yetzer Hara. That's not, which is what, as the Targum Onkelos says, is what Hashem really meant, but rather your enemy is Hevel. Because, when there's competition between two, and in this case, two brothers, you can see it in both ways. You can see that the loser is jealous of the one who's victorious, but you could also see from another perspective, that the one who's victorious has set up an agenda plan to defeat the other brother. I'm gonna up it on you, meaning I'm gonna bring a better carbon. You'll see that God will accept my carbon and not yours. As if to say that Hevel was scheming and had created a very sophisticated plan and program to see to it that God would reject Hevel. I'm sorry, that God would reject Cain. That's the way Cain interpreted. In truth, Cain was guilty of his jealousy. Hevel was pure in his intentions, wanting to bring the most wonderful carbon that he could. But Cain saw it as a competition in which Hevel was trying to defeat him. So that when he heard from Hashem, Elecha Chukaso, he thought that Hashem was telling him something about Hevel and his desire. And then Hashem said, V'ata timsholbo, but don't be concerned because you'll defeat your brothers trying to defeat you. Hevel understood that Hashem was revealing something that Cain had to know, namely that in his heart of hearts, Hevel had plotted to destroy. Okay, now we'll look at the very next piece in Reb Meir Simcha. That's Dalid Pasuk Chava. So once again, let's open up the Chumash. This is the last pasuk in Perek Dalid, and the Torah opens up with a discussion about Shes. Shes is the father of Enosh. And then the pasuk ends with 5 words that don't seem to be connected to the beginning. Oz huchal likro b'shem Hashem. So Rashi says that the word huchal comes from Lashon chulin, the desecration of something holy. And that began with Dor and Nosh. That's how Rashi sees the flow of this pasuk. Oz huchal, Rashi says Lashon chulin, likro eshmos adam veshmos atzavim b'shmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu asosen elilim v'likrosim elohus. So they started calling different beings by God's name. This was the turning point. This was the turning downward of mankind, of chulin, and the beginning of Avodah Zarah, starting with Dor Enosh. That's how Rashi learns. However, if you take a look in Targum, he has a totally different take on this. He learns that B'yomai cholu b'nei Enosh militzala'a b'shma Hashem. Now, I have a sefer here on Onkelos. Maybe by chance he says something here. But I don't want to hold us up because we have very few minutes left. So if anybody wants to stay a little bit longer, believe me, I'll climb up to the top shelf here and take down this Yein Atov on the Targum and see. But in any event, one thing is clear, that Onkelos is not talking about Avodah Zarah at all. He's talking about prayer. He calls it Slah. So something happens at this moment in terms of prayer, according to the Targum Onkelos. And here's where the Meshech puts his right foot forward. And he says the following. Hine, the Parshas shel Kayin, lo ksiv rak Hashem. If you notice, and you're careful about it, you will see that in the whole story of Cain, which is at the beginning and the bulk of this chapter, of chapter Daled, the name of God consistently is Yud Kei Vav Kei. Why is that so? Because the Parsha of Cain is the Parsha of Korbanos. This is the first generation of mankind after Adam and Chava, and they are dedicated to bringing Korbanos. Hevel brings his Korban and Cain his. Why is it so important that the name of God is Yud Kei Vav Kei? Ben Azai Sof Menachos. Ben Azai says that if you look carefully, the Parsha of Korbanos, the only name of God that appears consistently is and exclusively is Yud Kei Vav Kei. There's no mention of Kel, of Elokim. It's only Yud Kei Vav Kei. And the reason for that, says Ben Azai, is Shelo Litein Pischon Peh Lebal Din Lachlok. Kidei Shelo Yitein Pischon Peh Leminim Lomar Shemakrivim Chalil Leisa Koach Nifrad V'Kayotzi B'Seh. In other words, the name Elokim is indicative of what we call Balak Kokos Kulam, God as the source for all these powers in nature. Within the context of Elokim, there's room for Avodah Zarah. You begin to look at these powers and attribute to them the status of original sources. And now Rabbi Simcha wants to tell us that Likros B'Shem Hashem, the Yud Kei Vav Kei, is an allusion to the Parsha of the Korbanos. V'hinei achrei shehevel nerad avur Korbanos. Although it's a wonderful endeavor that the people on the face of the earth bring Korbanos, but nevertheless, this led to the murder of Hevel. Is Pasku Anshe Ador L'Akriv Korbanos. They realize that Korbanos is a dangerous enterprise. It creates jealousy and it can lead even to murder. So they refrained from bringing Korbanos. If that be the case, then the Korban, which is meant to publicize Yud Kei Vav Kei, meaning that there's one God and only one God. We worship and we serve only one deity. And take away the name Elokim, which lends itself to possibly the Michshol of Avodah Zarah. Now they're no longer bringing Korbanos. So the Pasuk wants to tell me, how will they now achieve their goal and their responsibility of publicizing the name Yud Kei Vav Kei and declaring that there's one God and only one God? Uchal likro kulam b'shem Hashem. Now, instead of Korbanos, they called out God's name. But so no longer does this mean? Shepirsemu avodas Hashem yisparach v'ashkachaso al yidei Korbanos. That originally they would use the Korban as the conduit, the method by which they would publicize the avodah of Hashem, God's absolute, exclusive, his unique oneness as the only deity and the providence of God on this world. But now they no longer have that method of publicizing that there's one God. They can no longer use the Korban as that method because they realize that the Korban was a very dangerous, potentially dangerous enterprise. So now they need Likro B'Shem Hashem. Where do we find Likro B'Shem Hashem means to publicize the oneness and the unity of God? We find it by Avram in Parshas Lech Lecha. We'll find it by Yitzchak in Parshas Toldos. Vayiven Mizbeach Vayikra B'Shem Hashem. If this be the case, then the Sefer of our Pasuk Chavav, has nothing to do with the Reisha, has nothing to do with Shais and Enosh. On the contrary, we're at a turning point in which man finds an alternative for Korbanos to achieve the same goal. And what is that alternative? It's going to be Tefillah. That's what the Tagavukalis has in mind. If you don't have a Korban to publicize the name of God and his unity, then the substitute, the fallback, is going to be Tefillah, is going to be prayer. So, Az Huchal, Likros b'Shem Hashem is a reference to tefillah. And the uz is critical over here. The uz is a wedge between the beginning of the pasuk and the end of the pasuk, telling you that what's coming up at the end of this pasuk is a reference to the beginning of this parsha, namely the parsha of Korbanos. And uz, in the aftermath of the murder of Hevel, Korbanos was no longer a conduit to serve this function of Pirsum Shem Hashem. Now they had to find another outlet in order to achieve the same goal, and that was tefillah likros b'Shem Hashem. Umusav uz al shalamala. The uz is like an arrow that tells you to go back to the beginning of this parsha, and I'll show it to you in a parallel way in the parsha of Ekev in Sefer Dvarim. It says, "Be'es Ivdil Hashem es Shevet Levi." So here we have to open up to Perek Yud in Sefer Dvarim Pasuk Ches. It says, "Be'es Ahi Ivdil Hashem es Shevet Levi," and the psukim before them deal with the masos, where they went and where they encamped. What does that have to do with Be'es Ahi Ivdil Hashem es Shevet Levi? The answer is that this pasuk is not going back to the 2 or 3 psukim before it that record the masos, but rather it's going back to the beginning of the parsha. And the beginning of that parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu castigates the people because of the Chet HaEgel. And as a result of the Chet HaEgel, Hashem chose Shevet Levi, Uz Hivdil, Be'es Ahi Hivdil Hashem es Shevet Levi. So similar to what we find there, he's using that as one example where at the end of a parsha, the Torah is giving you an arrow to go back to the beginning of the parsha. Here too, this uz is serving as an arrow to tell you to go back to the beginning of the parsha. Now officially we ran out of time. I just want to look up the Targum Ukelos, but if you don't mind, if you can stay just for 2 more minutes, then open up. I left this for the end because it's a very profound Rabbi Simcha that requires a lot of work, but I just want you to be aware of it. Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu. This is Perek Aleph, Pasuk Chav Vav. And Rabbi Simcha has a brand new take on what is Tselem Elokim. And he says Tselem Elokim means freedom of choice. Just like God has freedom of choice, so too man is B'Tselem Elokim. He also is endowed with freedom of choice. And why is this such a phenomenal breakthrough on a philosophical level? Is because God knows exactly what you're going to choose. But Yidiyaso Eino Machras HaBechira. How is it that God knows what I'm going to choose, and yet I have freedom of choice? And he quotes the Rambam here that God's knowledge is a different kind of knowledge qualitatively. It's part of the Atzmus of Hashem. And it's not like our knowledge, which is external. You have the human being and his knowledge. God and his knowledge is one. And that does not undermine our freedom. He says that even though we can't understand and comprehend what it means that God has this knowledge, this yediyah, and what's the quality and the nature of that yediyah in such a way that's part of his essence, his with a capital H, so that it doesn't undermine Bechira. We can't understand that. If we could only understand that, then we would be God himself, meaning man could never aspire to understand and comprehend this concept of God's yediyah, which is his atzmuso, his very essence. However, what we do know is there's something called tzimtzum, which is a very common Kabbalistic concept. And what Hashem is doing here, in order to allow for man to have freedom of choice, is he's being mitzamtzem his yediyah. In other words, even though he knows what you're going to choose, he withdraws or contracts that knowledge. That's called tzimtzum. And therefore, meiniach makom lebruav, he leaves space for man, lasos kafi ma sheyivchuru, to act based on their own decision. And man now can be poel, and God rejects his knowledge, his gzeira, that he absolutely knows what man is going to choose. And this is based on what's called tzimtzum. V'lachein Omar, now we understand the pasuk. Before it says Nasa Adam B'Tzalmo, it says El Libo. And God is speaking here in human terms. And what is God saying, El Libo? What is he saying to himself? Kaviyachol. Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu. Tzalmenu means with Bechira Chavshis. Sha'amar naniach makom lebechira sa'adam shelo yeh muchrach mif'olav u'mechuyev b'machshavosav yeh bechiri chavshi lasos tovo rak kasher yichpotz nafsho v'yochel lasos dvarim neged mizgo hativi v'neged hayosher b'nei Hashem. So this is what Hashem was saying El Libo, as the pasuk says, it nasa adam b'tzalmenu meaning that we will remove any force that would force man to make a certain decision and act in a certain way, even though we have these machshavos, even though God says, I know what man is going to choose, I am going to be mitzamtzem and allow man freedom of choice. Okay, there are both sides. If there are any questions or comments, now's a good time. I'm going to climb up to get the sefer down. The Yena Tov, to see what he comments on this Targum Unkelis, Perik Dalid Pasuk Chavav. He very rarely comments on Unkelis, very, very infrequently. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Boy, this is going to be a project here. To get this sefer down, but let's see if I can manage. Oh, am I killing this? Okay, 1 second. Okay. I'm alive to tell the story. Yena Tov. Let's just see if by chance we'll luck out here and he'll comment on this. His comments are very, very short, very abridged. I'm looking here for Perek Dalid. Not so user-friendly. He doesn't tell you on the top of the page what chapter he is. You have to keep turning pages. Oz huchal likro b'shem Hashem unkelis ben yomoi chalu b'nei anoshel etzallah b'shma de Hashem. He says, Oz b'yomav, in other words, during the time of Shays, not from the beginning of his life, but during his time, Hischilu b'nei Adam lispalel b'shem Hashem. He says it, Hischilu lispalel b'shem Hashem. It's the exact opposite of Rashi. Rashi says that Oz huchal means they made it chulin. It's the beginning of Avodah Zarah. And the Unkelis says, no, this is a turning point. Man begins to pray to God. And Rabbi Meir Simcha wants to understand what that means. And the answer is they stop bringing korbanos. And the Uz takes us back to the beginning of the parsha. namely the murder of Hevel. And in the aftermath of that murder, they stopped bringing korbanos. But what did they do instead? So Rashi says they started worshiping Avodah Zarah. Dunkler says they started being mispalit, and that was their method of publicizing the name of Hashem. So honestly, I'm absolutely thrilled that our translation of the words of Onkelos here at the very end of Perek Daled is the correct translation according to the Einat Tov, that it means Hischilu b'nei Adam lispalel b'shem Hashem. So Heichelu, Huchal doesn't mean to desecrate, miloshen chulin, but Huchal means to begin, and Likros b'shem Hashem means tefillah. And in the footnote he writes, Hischilu tzadike adar lidrosh l'rabim b'shem Hashem. Now he wants to somehow reconcile this with Rashi. Ki hutzuchu listar deos ovdei avodah zarah sheschilu os. He wants to make a combination of Onkelos with Rashi. Rashi's pointing out that this was the point in history when avodah zarah started becoming rampant. And Onkelos is telling us that the tzaddikim of the Dar realized that they had to take measures to offset the spread of these deos, of these ideologies of idolatry. And what steps did they take? They started to be doresh b'shem Hashem and to be mispalel. Again, let's keep in mind that there's a fundamental difference here between Rashi and the Targum in terms of the word huchal. Huchal, according to Rashi, means chulin, desecration. And the Targum says that huchal means laschil, to begin. Okay, then, so that's something that is...
it's interesting. You were saying that the parasha here, it brings out the Yud Kei Vav Kei, when it starts using Yud Kei Vav Kei on its own. Because the parasha, the very beginning of Bereishis, is all Elokim. And the parsha of Adam and Chava, where the city, it's Hashem Elokim.
Right. And then we get to the
Every time
parsha of Karbanos, and in the parsha of Karbanos, it's just Yud Kei Vav. Why? Because that's the entire way and purpose of Karbanos, to indicate that God is Yud Kei Vav Kei. Once you start bringing Karbanos, that worship, that service could bring to a mixture of worshiping other powers on the face of the universe, and that becomes very dangerous if the name Elokim is being used. We have to avoid the name of Elokim, and that was Ben Azai's drasha. And within the context of Karbanos, you have to be super duper careful to use only exclusively the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And if that be the case, then once again, here in this pasuk, Oz Huchal Likos B'Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei should have some connection with the Yud Kei Vav Kei at the beginning of this parak, which deals with Karbanos. And now we can say that Oz Huchal, if we take the Targum, they started publicizing the one name of God, meaning that God is only one, there are no other deities to be worshipped, in the context of tefillah, and it sounds very similar to the avoda of Avram and Yitzchak, of calling out the name of Hashem, which means to make sure that people publicize that there's only one God, one deity, and not to worship any other powers.
Thank you very much.
There is a possible further, you could say in Rashi, when he says Loshen Chulin, is in Chulin as opposed to Karbonos, which would fit in with Targum.
Well, let's see. I'm going to read the Rashi to you again.
I'm not talking about the second part of Rashi. I'm just saying...
just the first part of Rashi.
Just when he says that Huchal is a Loshen Chulin, you could say it's Chulin as opposed to Karbonos.
Well, there's still a very far cry from chulin that's not karbanos and tefillah. I wouldn't say that if Rashi had in mind as Onkelos tefillah, he would use the term chulin. I wouldn't call tefillah chulin. The contrast here is a little bit off.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I'm
Shalom,
going to stop
shkoyach,
here and
shkoyach,
wish
and
everyone a
Chodesh
great.
Tov. Chodesh Tov.
Yeah, right. That's right. If I don't see you before the new
Take care.
month, and Chodesh Tov.